Sorry, the small screen thing is a challenge for me today. All right, 7, business, 7.1, our work program items. So here is the item that most people are concerned about. We're under 7.1.1 on page 27, policy statement amendment project. If we want to go ahead and start with a brief briefing, and then we can dive into conversation around this.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I'll start off with an introduction, and we'll note that our senior policy advisor and senior intergovernmental policy advisor are also here today to supplement and assist with any discussion that might be needed. We've brought you this briefing just to update the committee with regard to the plans for public engagement that we hope to be announcing soon and rolling out all the details. Also to provide the feedback updates provided by trustees for discussion by the committee, and also to provide possible project timelines. And that's a piece I would like just to speak to before we move into conversation. Just to note, the introduction to the timeline in the agenda notes that Trust Council may wish to discuss its desires. At this time, there is no project timeline beyond the public engagement. Council has not provided any further direction around how it would like to proceed. So given prior discussions about concluding during this term, staff have neutrally provided, not as a suggestion, this is neutral information around what would be needed to achieve that. So we're certainly recommending that this committee and perhaps Trust Council have a discussion around the project timeline and then offer any related direction to staff. So this is here for the committee's information and discussion. Also, following this meeting, we will really be focusing on the engagement phase and are really interested in hearing what the community has to say and what their ideas and feedback is. I would want to assure the public and trustees, we have not picked up a pen to make any changes to the policy statement. All our efforts are on engagement, and there has been no effort at all at the staff level to consider a redraft of any sort. So just want to assure people we are truly interested in hearing what people have to say and await that input prior to considering what changes may be required. So with that, perhaps I'll turn it back to the chair, but want to advise we do have those other staff people who are deeply involved available to the committee.
Thank you. So I hear several directions that we can take our conversation. Given the feedback from public comment, I suggest we actually have the conversation about timelines first, and maybe inside of that timelines, this question about redrafting, readings, all of that kind of thing. So would anybody like to go first? And I ask us as we talk about this, one, to not repeat each other unless it's to say I agree with you and then add on to it so that we can make our conversation progressive instead of repetitive. And I also ask that we are respectful to each other and really listen to each other, because I anticipate we may disagree on this issue. So, all right, if I can go ahead, Chair Luckham, would you like to speak?
Thank you very much, Chair Morrison, for the opportunity. I just want to acknowledge that indeed there is a lot of interest in the policy statement that has occurred in the last year or so, and but this has been a 10+ year project. And that said, there is no hurry. There are many issues within the policy statement that have been discussed with respect to amendments. There is no hurry on many of those items. However, I think there is some significance in wanting to recognize 3 areas of the policy statement that could use amendment in the short term in order to enable Islands Trust and Trust Council and LTCs to conduct their business in an appropriate manner in this century. And those are climate change. The policy statement is silent on climate change, including references to or comments or direction on climate change would be helpful. First Nations reconciliation and simply acknowledging the Salish Sea as Coast territory, not recognized in the policy statement. This can be and should be included. Certainly, there's an affirmation of the necessity of the protection of the environment, which is already in there, could certainly be strengthened as seen fit. the only other item that there's been a lot of conversation around, and I think that there's significant work that is happening outside of the policy statement at this time, is indeed housing. All forms of housing, all shapes and sizes, affordability, and just regular housing. That may or may not be necessary to add into the policy statement at this time, and indeed that will evolve quite possibly outside of the policy statement. And so I just would encourage that we seriously consider deciding on what we can amend, that we have consensus around, or at least a majority around, and indeed leave some of the more controversial topics for further discussion. That's my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee McConkey.
Oh, sorry, Deb. Hi, Chair. Thanks very much for your thoughts there, Chair Luckham. I appreciate that. It'd be really great to hear from trustees, because I literally have no idea what's going on with the policy statement. I'm hearing from Islanders that they think we should put it off until the election. And if that's the case, we need to say that right now. Where are we going with this? Because I certainly don't want to appear to the public as if we're doing some sort of secret covert effort to pass a bunch of laws that nobody wants, right? So I'm curious to know if trustees are committed to working together until the end of this term, or should we set this policy statement up for the next round of trustees to come in? I feel like that's an important kind of conversation to have right away, and I appreciate listening to everyone's thoughts. Thanks, and thanks to the members of the public for all their thoughts today.
Thank you. Chair Luckham, if you can take your hand down, that would be helpful. Trustee Rogers.
Thanks. And I put in the chat, I'm not sure how strong my connection is today. So if I wobble or you lose me, I apologize. So I for a while, in the sense that a lot of what we decide to do will depend on how the community engagement goes. And what we hear and what we think about after we have the community engagement. But many of the ideas that are and issues that people have with the draft of the policy statement are have been voiced, were voiced last year. We may hear many others that are, and I think that to a certain extent, what we hear and what we think about what we hear from the engagement that's going to go on in the next 10 weeks is going to decide for us and give us an indication as to our timing. Personally, although the chair says it's been 10 years, I am now in my 8th year as a trustee, and it was a topic of discussion in the I'll say the last 2 years of my first term. We had a lot of trouble getting traction around it. We thought we sort of found a way forward at the beginning of this term, and there are gaps in it. I would like to see us make some progress in terms towards the redesign. Does that mean it has to be finished this term? Probably not. It probably needs to take the time that it needs. But I go back to the discussion we had in July about what first reading means in terms of engagement, and what it means is that the concepts are ready to be put forward for commentary and consideration. So I'd like us to continue to move forward. I don't believe it should be set aside. I think we have an opportunity for the public engagement that we have now designed and committed significant resources to, and it would be problematic for me to just decide at this point, well, we'll just put it aside for the next trust council who doesn't have the immediate benefit of that public engagement. So I don't think it needs to be rushed, as the chair said, but I do think that continued progress is important. So I would like to see us continue to move forward. And I guess to use Trustee McConkey's options is to work together to move it forward as opposed to setting it aside. So that's the where I would stand on that. Thank you.
All right. As trustees continue to share, I would love to hear specifics if possible. If there's particular things that in the timeline on the page 29 of the packet that you think are working for you or not working for you. There was a number of comments related to that, and we've heard things in community about that too. So if there's specifics, that would be really helpful. Trustee Peterson and Trustee Rogers, if you can take your hand down. Go ahead, Trustee Peterson.
Thank you, Chair. I will say that in terms of some of what we heard from the public, the turnaround from the release of the public engagement, back to this committee, executive committee and trust council, I could see why that is perceived to be a very short time. I'll also say that I don't think we need to be married to this, needing to finish this project before the end of the term. But I also don't think that it's appropriate to stop work. I think that especially the issues around reconciliation are really important, and we need to be making the effort to move this along. And I'll just harp on my personal opinion, which is that the long period in between now and the last revision of the trust policy is making this a process for us and for the public a lot more of an ordeal. There's a lot more to understand. I'm just going to advocate to this committee, to staff and public that and any future trustees coming in, that I think we would all be better served by a more regular review of the policy statement. And I'll be continuing to advocate for that as an elected person. And if I'm not around at Trust Council next time, I'll be advocating for that as a private citizen. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, hopefully we don't get into that situation again. Trustee Rogers, I think your hand is still remnant. If Robert, if you can help him with that. Trustee Wright.
Yeah, I think the things that I'm hearing from the public is the speed. I'm not too sure exactly what that completely entails, but most of the complaints I hear are about a relatively small list of items within the content of the policy statement, and I think those can be resolved fairly quickly. I think the other issues that I've heard primarily about is the trust is expanding into areas of beyond its jurisdiction, and I've raised those items before, and I think that is probably one of the sticking points within the public. I think there's the two things we're speaking about. There's the structure of the document and also the content. And I certainly think that the structure is flawed. I think it's too repetitious. I think it's too redundant. I think it's just too complex. It just goes on and on and on and repeats itself. And it just, it's too confusing. So I think those issues can be resolved fairly simply. And if we can do that within this term, then I don't see why we should not continue. With respect to matters of content, then we're going to have to just put our heads together and sort those out. But I don't necessarily think we're going to finish all that in this term. And if that has to take place in the following term, I don't see a problem with that. So, thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Brent.
Hi, thank you. So I have a motion that I forwarded to Robert Barlow and I believe to Trustee Morrison. I hope you got that. I'm having difficulty sending stuff out these days, it appears. Anyway, my motion would be, I move that the Trust Programs Committee recommend to Trust Council that the timeline for passage of the revised policy statement be guided by and reflective of the public engagement process, rather than setting a timeline as currently provided in the pre-engagement materials. And so I'm hopeful that that will get discussion.
Just pause 1 second, Trustee Brent. Just pause 1 second. Do we have a seconder for that motion? Trustee Kale, I think. Trustee Kale. Okay, so go ahead, Trustee Brent, if you'd like to speak to your motion. And just one other second. Oh yeah, I see it there, Robert. Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Trustee Brent.
Yeah, I think this is somewhat reflective of what I've been hearing and what I've been hearing in the last 15 minutes. And I'm hoping it'll start a conversation, a further conversation. So that's it.
Thank you. So at the moment, just a second, I'm going to have to just capture the speakers list here for, just give me 1 second. So I have trustee Scott, Langerais, Critchley, and Kale on the prior sort of conversational tangent. So if you want to put your hand down, if you're not speaking specifically to the motion, anybody who's speaking specifically to the motion, if you want to go ahead. So I have Critchley, do you want to speak specifically to this motion?
Yes, I might as well.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, so I think it dovetails with the previous conversation. And actually, I think I would vote in favor of this. It's reflective of my views generally, that we shouldn't be creating a hard and fast timeline that we commit ourselves to and feel that we will have failed if we don't reach it. I think that having an election looming, as it were, in a few months' time is not necessarily a bad thing in the context of a discussion about trust policy statement. People will be able to have their views on the trust policy statement as part and parcel of their candidacy. That's not a bad thing. So I'm not persuaded that we need to stampede forward in a mad rush to finish this with the current cohort of trustees necessarily. There are advantages to that because obviously we have invested substantial amounts of time in understanding these issues and in getting the views of the citizens to this point and to the point that we'll be at when we've finished our formal consultation process. I have to say that I think that there has been kind of jumping of the gun by the public or some sectors of the public in regard to this being highly concerned about the trust trying to somehow ram this through. I've never felt that that was anybody's agenda who's been dealing with this, to ram it through or to do it in secret. I think we've always strived to be open and transparent, and I don't accept those sorts of criticisms. However, anybody who's going to stand for election in the trust is going to necessarily have to understand the principles and issues within the trust policy statement. And I don't think that they will be completely at a loss or starting from ground zero if the work of this revision is to continue through the next term before it gets approved. All right. As to what has been said about the topics that must be dealt with, in my view, the one that is most necessary to deal with.
Trustee Critchley, if I can keep us on the motion at the moment and come back to other sort of related topics.
Well, yes, I suppose I'm starting to stray from that. So I'll end my comments there. Thank you.
But I will keep you on the list to come back to after this motion. Pick up there. Okay, I have Trustee Cayley.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, yep.
Thank
Even
you.
all the way from where you are.
Thank you. I so support this. One of the reasons being it gets us off the hook and the accusation that this is being rushed. This is a very reasonably worded and logically phrased motion, in my opinion. So it gets us away from being rushed. Why is this motion important? Because creating that trust, if you like, also means when people point to a pending review, they append to other issues not directly related to the trust policy review, then this is one of the obstacles removed that when those other factors come to greater light and comments are fully received, then this motion becomes, I think, really meaningful, and that's why I'd like to support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Colburn?
Hello. Yeah, I do not support the motion. This implies that there's going to be some universal consensus guided by and reflective of public engagement. That's not how public engagement works, folks. There's also been a very important and I think very overdue First Nations engagement. This makes no mention of that. Public engagement is not going to yield. Do it this way, you're going to get a lot of contradictory information. There's a lot of voices we haven't heard from. There's a lot of voices who are sort of self-selecting in terms of their ability to take part in the meetings, get in delegations. We have to be very aware that we're allowed more time for public engagement. That's important. But in my opinion, not changing some of the things that are so necessary to change, from climate change, reconciliation, and many other pieces, it would be a monumental failure of the task that's been put in front of us of elected officials in 2022 now. And I'm not going to support this motion for those reasons.
Thank you, Trustee Colburn. And again, just speakers to the motion. I do have some speakers that will circle back to more generally. So just to the motion right now. Trustee Langerice, did you have something to the motion?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good, but my video is not working. Yeah, my question around this motion is it saying that the timelines are to be thrown out? Or what? Are at the Trust Council meeting in March, are we to reset a new timeline or not? I'm not quite clear. I can understand the intent of the first part, which is that the engagement process will sort of establish potentially some time or adjusted timelines. We have to set timelines for our projects. We can't just not have a timeline. And if the issue is to compress time, then that could be discussed at Trust Council about maybe we need to extend it, because we'd set timelines all the time. We had timelines back earlier in the year and it got changed because that's so the timelines are set as an anticipated end date, but it doesn't mean that we stick to it. It depends on what happens during this whole process. So I'm okay with the first part of the motion. The latter part, rather than setting a timeline as currently proposed, begs the question, are we saying strip out timelines, or are we saying review the timelines in March? I'm just not totally clear on what the intent is here.
All right, we'll come back at the end to the mover and just see if you can pin questions. Trustee Critchley and Colburn, I'm assuming your hand is still up, so just if it is, if you can put it down. Trustee Peterson.
Thank you, Chair. I want to just agree with Trustee Langerice there. We need to have, I think one of the problems in the way that we've been talking about this timeline, and maybe it's an issue that we can think about in terms of better communicating to the public that, this is a timeline. It's not a hard and fast timeline. It doesn't preclude amending the timeline. But I do agree that, we can't just, it seems unreasonable to not have a goal. I also just want to point out, I don't think it's helpful to talk repeatedly about rushing, that we're rushing or that we're ramming things through. I mean, we hear that from the public, but I don't think it's helpful for the committee to be using that kind of language. That's just my opinion. This timeline is a goal. So I'm not in support of the motion as it stands.
Thank you. Trustee Wright.
Yeah, I'm just not sure of the purpose of this, other than trying to cater to a specific audience here. I'm not aware of a hard timeline that has been established already. All our timelines, in my experience at council, have always been fluid. I don't see this as being an example where that would not be followed. Of course, that we are going to be guided and reflect public engagement in our thinking. That's our job. So I'm not really sure the purpose of the motion, and until if I don't get clarification on those points, then I'm not going to support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I too don't support the motion. I mean, the introduction to this whole briefing was on the grounds that this mission or the timeline was a timeline it's set as to what it would take to get through to fourth reading by the end of the term, only because that gave them a goal and a means of managing the project. And as mentioned by Trustee Wright and others, that this is just how we do project management. Can't work without some form of sets of goals and managing staff accordingly, and including our own trains of thoughts. So to say as it stands, I'm not in support of the motion. Thank you.
Thank you. Trustee Brent, do you want to wait for Trustee Scott to weigh in, or do you want to go now? Okay, so Trustee Scott.
Thank you. I'm going to support the motion for a very simple reason. I think we do have the flexibility, as it's been described within the Trust Council, but I just think it sends a message out to the folks out there that we are not indeed pushing this. So I think it's a good message, and it's simple, so I'm going to support it. Thank you.
Trustee Brent.
I'm trying to listen to the trustees and see if there's a couple of tweaks that might be considered. I'm not sure whether a mover can amend his own his own motion.
No, I would prefer that we make it clean and like vote it down and re-motion if we're going to do that, just to make it.
Okay, but one thing I would say is I think it would be better. I listened to Trustee Colburn, and I agree with him that we should just use the word engagement process or the phrase engagement process rather than public engagement process.
So do you want to make an amendment? Can we have somebody suggest an amendment to that then? Trustee Rogers, is that an amendment I hear or another comment?
No, it's I've been listening, and I think I agree with many of the comments that were made. I also agree that from what I said earlier, that I think the process is iterative. So I do have a proposed, although I'm not sure that it, as Trustee Wright said, whether it really does anything, but I was going to propose that we take all the sections out, all of these out after the word process, i.e. rather than all that section, and put in the words be after policy statement.
So can you just read the motion that you would have so we
understand? Okay, so I would move that the motion be amended by removing the language after process. You know what? It's easier to defeat it and put a new motion on. I mean, honestly.
And that addresses the public engagement too. So okay, so I'm going to offer a suggestion to the committee. If we defeat this and then put a new motion that would read something to the order of that the Trust Programs Committee recommend to Trust Council that the timeline for the passage of the revised policy statement be guided and reflective of the engagement process, period. That's what I'm hearing from all of the different conversations so far.
Second.
Trustee Brent would go for that. Okay, so what I would suggest right now is that we defeat this motion and we put the new one on the table that we just suggested. Okay, I'm going to ask Trustee Scott, is that a new hand or a remnant hand?
Well, I'll leave it up, but I think I'll make the motion to defeat, to whatever the word is, the first motion.
Okay. So I'm going to ask for a vote on the motion that's on the table right now in front of us. And I'm going to read it out just to be very clear. So it was moved and seconded that the Trust Programs Committee recommend to the Trust Council that the timeline for the passage of the revised policy statement be guided by and reflective of the public engagement process rather than setting a timeline as currently provided in the pre-engagement materials. All those in favor, hands up, please. Okay, hands down. All those opposed. Okay, thank you, trustees. Hands down, that was defeated. Trustee Scott, I'm gonna go to you. I think you had that on your, or I'm happy to whoever. Trustee Brent, if you want to like restate the new motion, I'm fine with that too, whatever works.
I'll restate it. Thank you.
Okay, yeah.
I move that the Trust Programs Committee recommend to Trust Council that the timeline for passage of the revised policy statement be guided by and reflective of the engagement process, period.
Okay, so just let's give our lovely note taker here a second to catch up with us. And do I have a second for that?
Yes, second.
Okay, I have Michael seconding. Okay, just if you can check it, Trustee Brent, make sure we got it here.
Yes, it is accurate. And interestingly, I had already crossed that out. So frighteningly, Dan and I are thinking the same way.
Okay. So we have heard people's general thoughts across the initial emotion. If there's any different thinking that you have related to this one, I would ask that you share. I realize I didn't share my own thinking on the first motion, other than to integrate people's changes. So maybe if I can just put forward a little bit of thinking on this motion. I mean, I think we do this anyway. And I think so stating it is not problematic to me. And if it's a necessary thing that people are confident that we are actually listening to them, fine, that's totally fine by me. I think it's a little bit performative, I have to say. And I think it's stirred up a little bit by the rhetoric that we're hearing of rushing, of setting deadlines. I mean, we set deadlines on every project and they get revised constantly. So it's a little exhausting hearing that kind of rhetoric, frankly. But I do think that this is appropriate if people have those concerns to allay them. So I'm fine with this. Any other comments that are in addition to anything that you've said already? Please try
Madam
not
Chair,
to repeat everything. Yep.
if I may,
Yes.
I don't believe there's a second to
Yes,
this
there
new.
is. Yeah, Michael
Oh,
Cayley.
I didn't
Yeah.
hear that.
Yeah,
Thank
sorry
you.
about that. Yeah, you were copying me, so sorry about that. Yeah, Michael Cayley. Thank you for checking though. Trustee Wright.
Yeah, I too will support this motion on the principle of it's always a good idea to state the obvious, I suppose.
Okay. Any other new thinking? All right, I'm going to go ahead and call the vote. Oh, wait a minute. Disappeared. All right, I see the hand waving in the air. Technology is not working for our
don't
staff
know what's happened.
No worries. I'm just going to
apologize.
pause for a second. No worries. That happens. And I do thank trustees for keeping their comments on topic and like not repeating things. It's very helpful to move us forward on this work and when people are really just listening to each other and incorporating thinking. Thank you for that. Trustee Brent, you don't happen to have it in front of you, do you? Oh, you're muted.
I move that the Trust Programs Committee recommend to Trust Council that the timeline for passage of the revised policy statement be guided by and reflective of the engagement process.
All right. Thank you very much. All those in favor of the motion? Hands up, please. All right. Okay, hands down, please. All right. Trustee Fenton, thank you. All those opposed to the motion? Okay, that motion carries. Thank you very much, trustees. All right, I'm going to return to our prior speaking list in considering any kind of questions, comments, thinking. Regardless of if this motion being on the table, we still should think about general like stuff in the universe and give guidance to council because they are going to, go forward and be informed as the engagement process starts to wrap up and thinking about it. So we should provide some form of guidance. So I have trustee Scott, Langerais, Critchley, and Kale. So trustee Scott, go ahead.
Thank you. I'm going to start off by saying I think what we're doing here is engaging with the folks with the wrong document, because we've heard so much against it. I think it's incredibly difficult to take a 35-page document and take it out to the people and ask for their comments on it. So I'd just like to give you an example on Hornby. I went on the radio a couple of times and I did describe it, encourage people to go and look at it. We wrote it up in the first edition, our little newspaper on the island. And I know of 4 people on the island that have read it, have looked through it completely. That's Alex and I, our ex Tony Law, and the chair of our APC. One person I know I encouraged to read it, who's got a PhD, very intelligent woman. I encouraged her to read it, and she got through about 3 pages of it and said, I just can't handle it. There's too much detail. I don't know where it's going. So I think to take this document out is actually, I'd like to take a much clearer, simpler version out to the public and then ask them to comment on that rather than trying to comment on a document, which I think I agree with is seriously flawed, and it definitely needs to be shortened or people just aren't going to engage with it, at least not on Hornby Island. So those are my comments. So I just like to leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Trustee Langerais, then Critchley and Kaylee. And Trustee Kaylee, I'm just going from my prior list that I have in front of me. So Trustee Langerais.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. I was going to comment on the timelines, and that's been dealt with. I think one of the issues here is that we need to unpack what has actually changed for the public. You know, there's a massive rewrite of the policy statement. Some of the changes are purely wording, do not actually create a substantive change. Some of it is stylistic. And there are also inherent problems in the current policy statement. You know, the confusion around the trust council commitments versus the local trust committee directives. You know, what's the role? What's the purpose of that? So I think that we need to unpack that, and I think we need to do it in a piecemeal way. Take certain components of it and let's explain it. And that brings me to the issue of the consultation. You know, we're aware of the process, but what's the content? What's the content? How are we going to explain the why of what is and why does it need to be changed? I think that's going to be critical, because I did a, you know, there's been comments made, well, the shalls have overtaken the shoulds, that there's 91 shalls. Well, I did a look at the trust policy statement, the review, the current and the past, and all directives use shall. The increase in shall occurred because the advocacy policies changed the word encourage to shall. So if the issue is the advocacy aspect of our trust policy statement, we need to let, you know, that's another issue than what will actually happen to OCP and LUB. So I think that we need to clarify for people what actually is going on, what actually changes, you know, and be detailed about forestry. That's been raised as an issue. Oh, we're tree cutting, whatever. If you look at the directives, which is what we are bound by as a local trust committee to respond to, there are 6 directives related to tree cutting forestry. None of them include power, because that's strictly a request from trust council, and maybe that's the issue, but that doesn't mean the OCP is going to get changed. We don't have that authority. Forestry concerns, and all of the amendments to the current policy directives are minor changes. They're not excessive changes necessarily, but I think that there's a concern overall about what you said before. Well, there's a movement, too much focus on the environment and not enough on people, and maybe that's the genesis of it. Because I don't see the change in forestry being that excessive or that extreme. So that's just some of my, so my concern is, what are we taking out to the public in terms of explaining why we're changing and what are the issues?
Thank you.
Okay.
Trustee Critchley, if you want to come back to the points that you pinned for us.
Thank you. Actually, I'm getting off on a slightly different track this time than what I intended before. I want to associate myself with the comments made by Trustee Scott. I hear that on Denman Island also. And I think it's a very fair point that the document as presently constructed and presented is extremely difficult to read for most people. Obviously, I've got experience in reading complex documents, so I'm not particularly concerned for my own part, but we have to think of our consumers here. And one suggestion that has been made numerous times by a member of the public is that we take apart the document to winnow out those parts which are, let's say, mandatory, the shalls, and create a separate document or have it as an appendix. However we style it, I'm not too bothered about, but I think there should be a separation of really, let's call it the guts of the thing. Those things which are mandatory, that we're saying to local trust committees, you shall do this. And then the rest of it can be in the way of preamble, setting the table, aspirational kinds of things. There's a lot to like about this document for my part, from a literary standpoint. I think there's some very nice turns of phrase and use of language in the document. And I don't want to be seen to be criticizing staff for the way in which this is done, because it's basically following the way that trust policy statement has been done in the past. And that is to have this kind of amalgam of a document. It's because it's a constitutional document. I think it needs to be rather sparse in the things that it actually mandates. A constitutional document is generally going to have lots of whereases and wherefores and set the table as to the context and the circumstances of the document's creation. But at the end of the day, it's going to be pretty pointed and concise in its mandatory provisions, which are the things that people are going to be really more interested in. So I would strongly advocate that we go through a process to pull this apart into at least two pieces, and which is the main document and which is the annex or appendix. I don't care, but separate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Trustee Critchley. I'm going to put myself on the list after Trustee Cayley too. If others want to speak to any of these pieces, please put your hands up. Trustee Cayley.
Okay, thank you. And please bear with me for a moment, Chair. If I just reflect that being the only municipality, I've been actually struggling quite hard to get groups of people who understand the role of the trust, firstly, and secondly, understand this document. The very first question that I was asked is, has the municipality seen it? Answer, yes. Have they had a chance to respond to it? Answer, yes. So far, so good on that. When we got into the details, I don't have to tell you, we won't go into what were the major areas of concern right now, because I don't think you want to hear that. But the fact is, the largest objections were, firstly, was the rush in inverted commas. And I'm very pleased we've passed that motion, because hopefully that will help, that will alleviate that problem to some extent. And secondly was the word shall, and everyone's been counting up in the document how many shalls we've got. And I'm sorry about that, but that has been a real distraction. And to what extent in your only municipality does it limit and govern or restrict the municipality from where we are right now? So I agree that the document itself, yes, a few people will read it, very few. You've heard from, I'd like to reinforce from this area of the trust properties of the trust region, that the need to simplify. I'm not necessarily suggesting executive summaries, but most people will want to know, what does it mean to me? And when you look at a document of that magnitude, that is not the easiest question to answer. So I think you've heard it all, and I won't go on, but It has been hard slog right now, putting a positive spin on this. The amount of money that's been spent on external help to get this circulated hasn't been helpful. And whilst it's not on topic directly, we are dealing with two other issues running concurrently, and that hasn't been lost on people either. Commingling issues is extremely negative and it's dangerous, but we do live in a world where the three issues, the review, the budget, and the policy review are going on simultaneously, and politically, whether we like it or not, they are going to be grouped together, sadly. But there we have it. Thank you.
Thank you, Trustee Haley. I'll throw some comments in on this now too, if I may. So a couple things have come up for me that I think are deeply interesting. So we do have challenges around our communication with the public around the difference between the governance review, the trust policy statement review, and then, you know, the affiliated relationships that has with our budget. I am not actually a big fan of big budget increases without the governance review being resolved. But I don't necessarily want to see those cuts come out of programs that we know need to be done. I think that they potentially need to be out of other types of aspects of work in the trust. So having said all that, like related to this topic, and that's maybe just to build off what Trustee Kaylee is talking about with the commingling challenge we face. I also think that we don't have the luxury to do one thing, like to do all things at the same time. That's exceptionally complicated to try and fold all of those things. I do think we need to iterate heavily. So like we need to have a process, and I think we have set that in form. And I can't remember if it was with Trustee Peterson, I feel like had, you know, asked for that to be like annual or every 2 year kind of review of the trust policy statement. So we're not in this situation where we have 2 decades plus of like having to review things, right? So I do think that is at least a step in the right direction to try and get a more constant conversation, because frankly, while I think it stirred up a beehive in some ways doing the trust policy statement, I think it needed to. And I think that's good. Like the kind of comments that we've had and like the conversation and engagement we're having with our communities is actually needed. So I would say that I did actually vote for the governance review, and I know it was a very divisive issue among the Trust Council, but I do want to see what that looks like. I don't think I want to wait for the entire trust policy statement to be done. To something somebody else said earlier, I actually think, and maybe it was Chair Welcome, I think that what we really need to get down to at some point in March or in June is like, which pieces of content are we going to like stand on for this term, and which do we just think we need to move off to the next term? And because public comment has said like, we just don't understand enough. We haven't had those conversations in community about salinization plants or docks or whatever it is. Like those are the things we should just pull them onto a list and they go into the next round of edits and we have a longer conversation on those. So I also think that the rhetoric we're having around all or nothing in the trust policy statement is exceptionally problematic. So we simply don't have to do that, right? Like we can do a version of the trust policy statement right now that's lean and like organized and addresses some of the historical injustices that we have to deal with in our own work in reconciliation. I would say that's like my primary thing that I think we need to do. And like, if we don't get that done this term, I feel like we're hurting relationships in our own work in reconciliation. So at a bare minimum, that would be my floor, right? And then in terms of some of the things in terms of, but maybe just one other thing about that. Somebody in the public when they were commented that there was an entire new structure. That was probably my submitted comments as a trustee. And so as a trustee, which be clear, it's me as a trustee, not as the chair of the trust programs committee. All trustees are allowed to submit comments. It's me as a trustee doing that. So I sat down and spent 16 hours one weekend and like dreamed up what I would like to see out of all the information that we've been given about the trust policy statement, out of all the conversations and community and feedback I've received so far. What would I personally as a trustee like to see in the trust policy statement? And then I distilled it down to like a restructuring, because the restructuring issue was one of the key elements that I've heard as a problematic issue. And so again, to some of the points that have just been made by Trustee Critchley and Trustee Cayley and Trustee Scott, like I really think taking all of the advocacy work and putting it into schedules will alleviate a lot of challenges and issues, and having just the clearest and most consensus items in the front end is where we want to get to. So those are the kind of recommendations in terms of just restructuring that I think I would like to put forward in March as a suggestion to Trust Council. All right, wow, that was a lot longer than I expected. I'm so sorry. Maybe one last thing is, I do think that we have, while I hear people about like this is an election issue, and I do think there are some things that are election issues, you know, docks and salinization plants, until we understand more deeply what those things really are about and mean, I don't think we can really get them in, or should, you know, like, and, but I do think we have to accept that we spent a significant portion of public money. And the same people who are talking today and are saying that we should delay because it's being rushed, I would argue you're going to, in 6 months, say, why have you wasted all this money? And so I would challenge you to be very honest about the position you're taking, because I don't want to engage in a huge amount more like dollars if we don't actually have some spine and do something as trustees. So that what that is, for sure, that's open to conversation. That's what we're doing here. Okay. All right, I'm going to pause myself there. Trustee Peterson, I have you next.
Thank you, Chair. I just kind of want to dispute the notion that a policy document necessarily needs to be short, concise, and easy to read. I think that's kind of putting a false frame on what is, you know, tends to be a bit more complex. At the same time, I think that we could have, and certainly should in the future, be a little more clear about certain things so that some of the misconceptions that are out there maybe don't occur again and might not have occurred in this case. I'm just going to talk quickly about the directive policies, the shalls. We all know that they're in the existing document, and so it's not like directive policies are new. It's not like the draft is bringing in new restraints on LTCs, but that's part of the narrative out there, and that's trouble, right? It's perceived as new restrictions on the autonomy of LTCs. So just trying to get at thinking more clearly about how to communicate this kind of stuff out to the public. Again, I do think that if we were to engage in a more regular, as you say, iterative process, and that we are bringing this sort of thing, you know, a policy statement review on a regular basis before the public, then these kind of misperceptions would be less frequent and more readily addressed. So in terms of the density of the document itself, you know, I think it's fine to think about executive summary. It's fine to think about appendices, but I don't think it's reasonable to expect that our policy document is going to be an easy read for anyone to pick up and totally understand without some work. So that's just my comment.
Thank you, Trustee Peterson. I think I have Chair Luckham next.
Thank you very much, Chair. I realize I didn't just plug my headphones in, so I'm just going to try and speak really clearly to the microphone here. I have two points. I kind of put my hand up a while ago, and we bounced around quite a bit. And perhaps I lost the thread. I'll admit that's entirely possible here. But earlier on in the meeting today, we told the public, and what we said out loud, and have committed in other places to the public, that we are not going to be amending this document until we've heard from you. And yet, right now, right here, we're having a conversation about changing the document prior to having received all that input. And that I find confusing. So if somebody wants to straighten me out on that, that'd be great. But I have a question actually that I want to.
Chair Luckham, can I pause you just for 1 second and clarify that?
Yep.
So what we're doing here right now is we're having a conversation about trustee feedback too. So there's multiple feedback and engagement processes going on in parallel. The public is one of them. The trustees is one of them. First Nations is one of them. And all of those strands of feedback need to be collected and synthesized in ways that help inform what will be the final document. And doing them in series, like one after the other, isn't really authentic to how people are actually unfolding their thinking. So being able to name and make public and make transparent more of our thinking as it's unfolding, I think is helpful both to the public and their feedback, and also to trustees as they start to process and think things through. So I think that's, personally, I think that's the goal of having some conversation. Particularly, we are focused from Trust Council in December to really consider structure, right? So we're not really wanting to say necessarily like definitely include this, definitely don't include that. That's for more Trust Council conversations. Here, we're really talking about structure and timeline, and like feedback on timeline. And the timeline is the thing that specifically we're kind of like waiting to see how that unfolds relative to the other engagement practices. But we still need to think about structure to some degree.
Well, fair enough. And as somebody else said earlier, member of the public, it's about perception. And I would say there's a conversation of opinions about changing the structure. And this is a decision where I recommend, it's not a decision-making body, but it makes its own internal decisions and it makes recommendations. And I'm just saying, let's be careful about what we say with respect to it appearing to be advancing the discussion around amending the document. So the question that I have actually around the policy statement, and I'm struggling with trying to figure out how the public can engage with us in a meaningful way and understand and have the information that they need to be able to provide constructive feedback to us, to assist us in developing this document appropriately. And the policy statement is obviously a document that has been requested of us for some time by the province. And indeed, the most current version, which contains structure and language in it that we are now discussing, has been approved by the province. And so that document meets the province's criteria and, or I'm presuming, the request that the requirement that the Islands Trust have a policy statement. So my question is, through the chair to staff, Claire, whether or not you have any advice to us about what is it that the province is expecting or asking of us in the policy statement. And I want to ask you to comment on whether or not you think what you think about the current version of it. But just I'd like to know more clearly, when we submit this, what is the criteria that the province is going to be looking at to be sure that it meets their requirements for the Islands Trust to have a policy statement?
And just as you take that question up, Claire, if I can have you also, so Chair Luckham, you're using the word that the province has approved that. The province actually won't officially approve the statement until it's gone through all of its readings. We actually have a final statement. So they previous comment. Oh, the previous, thank you.
The previous policy statement has been approved with its structure and language, shalls and all that stuff. That's the question.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, go ahead, Claire.
So that's a question I might bring a more fulsome answer back to at another time. But generally, the Act calls for a policy statement, right? There's no further description within the Act, right? Where I think the province is looking for, so I think I would want to prepare I don't want to speak for the province, so I'm wanting to be very careful in my comments here around what their expectations may be. But at this time, I think we're working with a 25-year-old document that was approved by the government of the day at that time. It has served the Islands Trust over this time, but I don't think I can speak for the province as to what they expect now, except I know they will be looking closely at the engagement record with First Nations as they contemplate what lands with the minister. But I don't want to speak for the province at this point, if that's satisfactory.
And Claire, I appreciate that. I will actually speak more firmly. So the Act specifies that the Trust Council is the one to create the policy statement. And there are some criteria that we are working through with staff to try and understand what the legalese language needs to be without the redundancy challenges that we're hitting. So there is some like language specific type pieces that you know may need to be in there. And because we've had the feedback as it's, you know, we're watching the feedback as it's coming in. And some of the feedback is things that we've heard here today about just redundancy and like it's just too big, right? Like too hard, too dense to get through. And so, but there is some language that still has to remain. And so we're trying to figure out like what that language might be. We being the staff, sorry, the royal we, trying to figure out exactly what that language has to be so that that can help inform trustees' decisions as they make decisions about any changes and as the engagement data comes in and we get into some, you know, first reading ready version of the document. Does that help, Chair Luckham?
Yeah, it does. And it was a kind of a rhetorical question because I sort of think I know what the answer is, but I think that it's important that we have a common understanding or about that. But indeed, I think it's reasonable to clarify that with the ministry if necessary at this time. Because I think it's in the public interest to understand when they're providing feedback and making comments about it being overly directive or otherwise, and I just picked that at random. If that's the desire or the necessity of the document, then we have to take that into consideration. So I just want to provide information to the public in order to be able to provide positive feedback.
Thank you.
Or, yeah, constructive feedback is the better word.
So Claire and Delaney, if I can just ask for very briefly, do you need specific direction related to getting that as part of the feedback for the March meeting? Okay, so what would that look like? Because what I'm hearing from Chair Luckham as an action step is that we need clarification from the province about what legal language or what sort of official language they are going to require to be able to approve the policy statement and potentially any structural related issues. I doubt they're going to do structural, but maybe they are. So like what components does the province need for being able to get on board with whatever changes are made?
I would say yes, a resolution would be helpful. I will note that we're trying to get the council agenda package out by Friday. So if you are requesting input, I don't think we can achieve that agenda deadline, but perhaps could have some response by the province by March, although no certainty of that.
Yeah, I don't think it necessarily needs to be by March because we won't have all of the public engagement necessarily done until later anyway. So it's more informational for trustees. So at this point, okay. I don't know what that motion sounds like. If you want to think about what that does and like lob a version to Robert, that would be helpful so that I get it whatever it needs to be for the issue that just got put on the table. I'm just going to go over to Trustee Rogers. I am going to put us into a break in about 6 minutes so everybody can get up and shake their bodies and like actually move. And I'm going to hand over the chair at that time to Trustee Peterson. So Trustee Rogers, if you want to go ahead.
Thanks. Try and be succinct. First of all, can I just echo what Trustee Peterson had to say? I do find this whole idea that a 35-page document it's not I don't consider it a constitutional document. I consider it a guiding document like an OCP is too long in some vague context. When I look, I bet there's very few local trust committees whose OCP is less than 35. Every time I see the one from Galliano, which is 120 pages, I go, that community managed to do that. It doesn't seem to be a particularly overly burdensome document. Plus, it's not and then just in response to a couple of comments at the beginning of this session, The document that we've got is the one that we're taking out for public consultation. I mean, we're not going to get to the point unless we start all over again. And I know there's a sentiment out there that we should, of taking a different document. This is the document we're going to get the public comment area, and that's fair enough. I think it seems to me I have 3 brief points. One is I agree with the chair of this committee. The content of what's in and what's out will be decided by Trust Council. The second, I think the challenge will be how do we design a mechanism to address the issues around structure. We'll need a mechanism about that. And, you know, it doesn't mean that we need a small committee that is tasked with simply trying to talk in depth about what the structure looks like to assist the staff to develop that structure, because it's very difficult to have a conversation about structure and wording in a group of 26 trustees. So we'll need a mechanism to do that. The third thing I want to say is I think it's really important, and I've said this in my commentary, I don't think we can talk about the trust policy statement without talking about the trust policy implementation policy. The implementation policy is the actual document that tells the local trust committees how to go about implementing the trust policy statement. And it's been almost absent in the discussion about this. And it's problematic for me that we aren't having that conversation at the same time, because it's the one that says local trust committees can make independent decisions about what part of the policy statement to apply in their own local trust area and which ones not. And so I would really urge us to put that on the agenda as part of something that we need to have as part of this conversation as we go forward. And I am hoping as part of the public consultation that document is out there as well, or at least what's contained, the concepts that are contained in that document are out there as well, so that people and members of the public can see, here's the implementation policy. Thank you. I'll stop there.
All right. Thank you. I have Trustee Langerice and Trustee Wright on my list here. I'm going to ask you if you can try to do a kind of synthesis or wait until after the break. One or the other. It's up to you how you'd like to do. Trustee Langerice.
Okay, just really quickly, one of the questions I've got is the role of trustees in this engagement process. What will our role be? It's not really quite clear to me. Because I tend to put things out on the internet as well on my website on issues that on the trust policy statement, and that's why I asked the question about the content that will be provided, because I'm not necessarily certain as to what the interpretation will be versus my interpretation. So that's one of my questions, and I agree with Trustee Rogers about the implication of the shalls and how it impacts OCPs and LUBs. I think that's an important piece. People need to understand, when does it actually get action? When is it mandatory and when isn't it? So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Trustee Wright.
Yeah, I asked trustees a question some time ago about who the author is going to be of this document. And I think there is an expectation in the public that they will be the authors. And I think we should sort of clarify that one question of who is actually the person who's going to write it. We talked about public engagement, but I think some of the impressions that I get from listening to certain components of our constituents, that their expectation is that they shall do the writing. With respect to the word shall, et cetera, I notice there's a November 23rd in 2000, year 2000, a legal opinion considered the use of more mandatory language in directive policies. And the opinion argued that changing directive policies to require that local trust committees and island municipalities include certain matters in their official community plans and regulatory bylaws rather than address them. So we've had a legal opinion on that 12 years ago. So if that is mistaken, then perhaps we need to review that. But I don't think there'd be any change. Thanks.
Thank you, Trustee Wright. I'm going to pull our conversation to a pause. Trustee Peterson, thank you for being able to take over after the break. In just a minute or two, I'm going to ask us to take a 10-minute break. Get up, move, go get tea, get coffee, whatever you need to do. A couple quick logistical pieces. If there is something Okay, it was to the comment about trustees' role in the work. Trustees, so legally speaking, the Act states that the Trust Council writes the trust policy statement. That is what the Act says. Trust me, I spent a lot of time reading the Trust Act recently. So that, and from that perspective, we as a Trust Council think it's important for all of the, like for us to be able to hear and understand what our communities want to see in that. And also for us to understand what are our obligations related to reconciliation, what are our obligations related to the mandate and the object of the trust. So those are all of the things that we're trying to balance and understand. I would echo what Trustee Wright just said. I actually don't think that this is the same as an OCP, where you're actually in community writing and thinking together in a much deeper way. That is what we should be doing with OCPs. It is the daylight, like if we have, you know, tree management policies, forest management policies, those are things we should get detailed at the community level, and that we shouldn't have dictated in detail from the Trust Council level. But the overarching mandate related issues that the Trust Act says, yeah. And so I'm going to pause because I don't want to get too much into like soapbox. Trust me, you can phone me anytime. I'll talk about this. Yeah, so that's Trust Act. Trust Council writes the trust policy statement from a legal standpoint. And so I do want to also just make a apology again. I did it at the head of the meeting, but we had Omicron has really taken a toll in my work life, and we have a giant public webinar that nobody else can facilitate because everyone's ill. So I have to step in for it. And thankfully, we have a vice chair system here, and he's not sick. So Trustee Peterson is going to take over for me here. Trustee Peterson, there is a motion on the table related to just getting the feedback. Or not on the table, but if staff, I so need to just use first names. Claire, if Claire can just send it to Tim, and so that he has that, so after the break he can address that motion, that would be helpful. Okay, thank you all. 10 minutes. So we'll see you back at, or everyone else will see you back at 10:50. Thank you.